Everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Benj. This is What Could Be Bad. It's season 2 of the podcast. And I'm very honored to be here today with Dr. Judith Landau. Thank you for being on my podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be in your beautiful home. Thanks for having me here, too. It's special to be welcomed into somebody's home.
You're part of the family, so.
Oh, that's kind. You know, that's wonderful to hear, and I do feel like that too. And it's been such a amazing getting to know one another in an incredible way, working together to hopefully have a very positive effect on the community here in Eagle County. This is your home county. It's not mine, but you know, I came out here to do a speaking engagement for the GoPro Mountain Games, and it's led to all kinds of wonderful connections and a lot of hopeful goals. And I'm excited to work on them with you. And as well, I'm excited to learn from you as we go.
Well, I'm thrilled with your participation in our community. And I'm more hopeful than I've been for a very long time.
Wow.
So you're joining us with Megan McGee-Bonta, and her work is extremely exciting.
Yes, I really appreciate it. Megan's here helping us make sure everything's working. Megan's also a new friend, and she's one of the co-organizers for Mountains and Minds. And that is an extension of my goals with this podcast of elevating and destigmatizing mental health conversations. And that's something you know a little bit about. And I mean, for those of you who don't know, we're going to get into some really world-changing subject matter. And I have a deep respect for the work you've done. And I do want to start with your amazing mantra of, tread lightly and leave no footsteps. And I think that's incredible. And, as someone who, tries to do a lot of, good work in the world, charity work, philanthropic work, one of the core principles of that is not seeking recognition for the work. Is that one of the driving forces of what you do, or is there more to it than just that?
Well, it's specifically in transitional family therapy. The parent model was the first of the integrative family therapy models that I really brought with me from South Africa when I was recruited to teach at University of Pennsylvania many, many years ago. And then worked with my team, both in Philadelphia and then at University of Rochester, to develop the formal evidence-based model.
Yes.
And once that had been tested and shown to work, I have always been, growing up where I did, I've always been acutely aware of the shortage of people able to work in the field of behavioral health, mental health, substance use disorder, and really with any chronic relapsing disease, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional. And what I really wanted to do then was to find a way of adapting the systems model to be able to train members of communities to take the philosophy out into their communities and to be using evidence-based protocols. So that started a series of research studies through federal grants and state grants and some international grants for other countries. And what I discovered was that if the model was simplified, applied specifically to a cause, for example, the first of the evidence-based protocols was Arise Comprehensive Care with invitational intervention. And it's really changed the way that most interventionists work.
Okay.
Instead of coercing people into treatment, they're understanding that one needs to draw on their resilience and their family and friendship resources.
Sure.
So that they're motivated to go into treatment so they have the benefit. And so that was the first one that we tested, and we had psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, addiction counselors, and kids right out of Volunteer America. And as long as they learned the model, practiced it, followed the manual carefully,
Yeah.
they got the same results, regardless of age, experience, gender, ethnicity,
Wow.
or degree.
Incredible. Yeah.
And so that's one that is used all over the world. And for getting people who are resistant to get into treatment, whether it's for asthma, dementia, head injury, substance use, schizophrenia.
Yeah. There's so many.
Depression.
Yeah. I've dealt with depression, PTSD, anxiety, some anger from my PTSD. I think I'm not really an angry person by nature.
Right. But PTSD, removes our frontal lobe control.
Tell me more about that. I don't really understand. Like, so here's like the thing. I know what I went through, and I went through my therapies to heal, and I've done a lot of work with meditation and breath work to create
impulse
space.
control.
Impulse control for sure, which is part of my active listening that I'm working on. As you heard the other night, I made a joke that I need to do that more at home than I do on this podcast. But please educate me and everyone who might hear this about that, because I don't really know the actual mechanics of how our body works when we have that kind of disorder.
Yes. We see a very similar thing with post-traumatic stress as we do with mild traumatic brain injury or traumatic brain injury. As the brain develops, it starts, if we think about the development in utero and then afterwards. In utero, when we're just fetuses, or feti, whatever it is, and it's fetuses.
I don't know which one it is.
The brain starts with the reptilian brain, the lowest part of the brain, which is our very primitive survival brain. It's get out of the way of danger, so safe, security, sex, food, water, air. And that's it. So we share that. We share that with worms.
Interesting.
With centipedes, with the lowest form of reptiles.
And that's a certain.
And that's a part of our brain that stays there.
And that's while we're in the fetus stage, like the first few months or something like that.
And then the next piece to develop is the midbrain, and then the final piece is our neocortex, our new brain, which is the outer layer. And the part that's the most important is the frontal cortex, which doesn't develop fully until, we used to think, until children were 23, 25.
Years old, not months?
Yes, years old.
Oh, wow.
So adolescents tend to function more on the more primitive part of their brain. I'll do it now, without having the capacity yet to filter things through a frontal cortex that's fully developed.
I see.
And the last thing that happens with our whole nervous system, including the brain, have you ever seen an infant when one claps one's hands suddenly? And they go like this.
Oh, like they're startled.
They get a startle response, a Moro response. And that's because they don't have the lining of the nerves in the brain. So it's almost as though the myelin that coats our brains and our nerves is like the plastic around an electrical cord. They don't have that when they're tiny. That develops slowly, and it used to be in place by the time kids reached, girls 23, boys 25. They're now finding examples where myelination isn't complete until about 47.
Wow. Unfortunately for that, some people don't reach that age even. That's such a, we're fortunate in
because because we've been, modern medical science has given us an extra decade. So that decade, if you think of it with kids and adolescents, has given us a whole new loop in the developmental life spiral. It's a loop of young adulthood. And we're seeing changes in behavior that people are blaming the kids and saying they're failing to launch or they're behaving badly, but in fact it's a developmental thing where the extra decade is right there.
I see. So my 5-year-old's, outbursts are not his fault.
Not at all.
Okay. I'll try to remember that when they're really getting to me.
Right. So when people have a head injury
Yeah.
or PTSD, which is very similar, they don't have access to their frontal lobes. And then they go into that primitive fight,
or flight.
flight, freeze response.
Yeah.
And some people, a very small percentage of people, are fortunate to have a natural, their neurotransmitters, the little hormones
Yes.
that are responsible for our responses. We all come with the same ones, but we come with different amounts and different quality. So you can ask anybody and they'll tell you whether they have a fight, flight, freeze or cool, calm action response.
Okay. That's incredible. So like when I went through what I went through, that part of the processing of my thoughts wasn't able to provide me the ability
time and the ability to breathe. So all the things that we teach people to do to deal with their impulse control and their rage are slowing things down.
Absolutely.
So that one gets things out of the reptilian brain and the instant sort of reptilian response to a more measured, thoughtful response. But in the moment, that's almost impossible unless you're trained to breathe, to meditate, and to slow it down.
I certainly did a lot of training.
Or even to say, excuse me, I need 5 minutes.
I'm learning to do that and give that to myself as well. It's interesting to hear this about not the immediate response with just the general way I'm trying to approach conversations with people now. I think that's a healthy practice, but I've been reading a lot of the Stoic philosophies, particularly Marcus Aurelius, and, not allowing the anxiety and the thoughts that really affect, your relationships that come out in emotional capacity to be able to, discard the anxiety, to be able to allow it to go away and to come
sometimes
through
it's as simple, with I worked with a number of sports psychologists through the years, with athletes and our football team here and so on. And one of the things that is most useful is a very brief walk. With tennis players, walk to the back of the back fence and back.
Interesting.
And they come back with a totally different attitude.
That's interesting, especially because one of my practices that I've started my days with is to go for walks in the morning, and it's not that short, but I'll remember that may come in handy. But that's been an element of how I prepare myself and think about, visualize, what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it throughout the day. It's really helpful.
The Tibetan meditation walk is literally 10 steps forward and 10 steps back.
Oh, really?
I'll teach it to you sometime.
Yeah, I love it. It's just forward and then step backwards?
Yeah, but it's
a certain way.
Heel, toe, and it's sliding your feet and really being very mindful of each step.
Yeah.
And when you get to
Very
the 10, you
intentional.
go all the way back with slow breathing. And it's as efficient as an hour-long meditation.
This is incredible. I love that. Thank you. I mean, that's a gift right there. No, I love that. I'm going to employ that. That's like, I'm trying to build my...
and then you slide your other foot. And slowly, as you drop that one.
Yeah. And time it. I love that.
Yeah.
We'll practice after the podcast.
Good.
I love that. I've been trying to add things during all of these that I want to learn, and I want people to hear things that they can learn from. But Drew Peterson, who I interviewed yesterday, called it his mental health toolkit. And he wants to make sure that's always full of the right tools.
Right.
So interestingly, we were talking about that as well. Seems to fit the podcast pretty good.
Good.
Well, I want to ask you about some other things too, besides the science scientific elements and the human elements of your work are very interesting to me,
Right.
which I know I'm going to continue learning from besides just this hour. I'm really interested in hearing about your experience with apartheid. I've never met anyone who's like, or that I've been able to have a conversation with. Maybe I have met someone, but I'm really interested in what it was like in the community you lived in to feel that, and what was like the I know your family was involved. I'm just kind of curious if you can tell a story about it and kind of share some of the most impressionable aspects of it. I would like to just learn about it more.
Yeah, so it's difficult to know where to begin.
Yes, it's a broad,
I
big
think
thing.
I think it might be helpful just to have a little context.
Yeah.
So my father was a physician whose mission was to equalize the infant mortality rate and literacy rates of the first world, which included the white folk in South Africa, for everybody in the population.
Okay.
And just to get a picture of the South African population, there are 11 official languages now since apartheid ended. So there were people speaking 11 different languages, and that excludes all the immigrants, which are very similar to those here in the U.S.
Yeah, that was
So
parallel
Portuguese,
I was hoping we could get
Italian,
to.
Argentinian, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so you have all of those languages and cultures, but the predominant ones are the 11 official languages.
Okay.
So his determination was the infant mortality rate for the African population particularly was disastrous. And he was also very concerned about the status of women, and particularly, again, minority women. So he set about with his team establishing health and community centers in every region of the country.
Okay.
And so as a little girl, I traveled with him to all of those, learned to speak Hindi, Tamil, Gujarati, because we lived in an Indian area.
Yeah.
And then I learned the local African languages, South Sotho, Zulu, and then later Xhosa when I moved to the Cape. But as we moved, I was exposed to all of those different cultures, and each microculture is different.
Sure.
And being with the healers, the African Isangomas versus the Indian traditional healers, was what I thought was how things were done. Then on the home front, my parents' social circle were all people trying to right the wrongs of the country.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and they were, many of them before 1948, which is what we say that when we say the government fell, when the nationalist government came in. The many of them were mixed ethnicity couples, and their marriages became illegal and nullified the minute that government changed.
They just disavowed that they were legitimate.
Yes, they were no longer married, and they could no longer be together because of the miscegenation laws.
Wow. Yeah.
So, apart from the political issues, there were also all the ethnic issues.
Yes. Okay.
The other thing that happened was that people would be on. I mean, first of all, the Liberal Party, the fight, and the ANC, the African National Council, all started before the government actually fell.
Okay.
So, because the cognoscenti in the country all knew this was coming.
Yeah.
And I think it's important before it's so easy to get really angry with the nationalists and the Afrikaners. And it's so important to understand the history, and in some ways a lot of parallels with Palestine and Israel,
Yeah.
where when the British came to South Africa, they wanted the trade routes to the Spice Islands.
Okay.
So the British decided this was somewhere that they were going to colonize.
Yeah.
And so they immediately looked at how do they start owning the Cape of Good Hope and then the rest of the country. And they realized that in order to do that, they had to get rid of the Afrikaners, who were the majority because they were the progeny of the Dutch who had originally discovered the country.
Okay.
Dutch and the Portuguese, and Dutch in the Cape and the Portuguese on the East Coast.
Okay. Yeah.
And so they set about, they couldn't take over. So there was a series of what were called Anglo-Boer Wars. Boer means farmer.
Okay.
And after the second of these, they still hadn't won. So they started looking at why are they losing the wars. Realized that the farmers were fighting a commando warfare. They would go back to their farms at night, get refreshed, be with their families, and then come back. And they also didn't stand nicely in formation and shoot
It's like a
the way the
guerrilla
British did. Yes.
Approach.
It
Yeah.
was one of the early guerrilla wars.
Yeah.
And so what they then did was they rounded up all the women, killed many of them, rounded up the women and children. I wrote a story about one of the families where 13 children watched their grandmother and mother being killed as they were being rounded up and put in concentration camps. And something like 40% of the Afrikaans population died in the concentration camps of typhoid, starvation.
Sure.
3 of those 13 survived. 2 little girls living in the camp, and their little brother, who at 11 years old had fled and watched what was happening and fed them through the fence.
Wow.
So they survived. They stayed together for the rest of their lives, these 3. You know.
I mean, yeah, the bond
Yeah.
is created.
And they actually
something like
started
that.
a hotel that became the ultimate hotel in South Africa in the
Is that
early
right?
days, yes.
I need
So
to
they
read
wanted
that.
to share the hospitality.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really sweet.
yeah,
Generosity
yeah,
is
yeah.
a universal
huge,
language. Yeah.
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 So if we think about what then happened when the Afrikaners, and they weren't allowed to have education. You know, the British, what they did in Ireland, destroy education and health.
Sure. Yeah, that was their model.
So that
Yeah.
was what they did in South Africa. So the Afrikaners got together, and there were a lot of own businesses, got together, formed a brotherhood, the Broederbond, so it would never happen again.
Yeah.
And they then looked at who are threatening us. There are only 3 million whites and 23 million blacks. We'd better take away their education, health, and right to own businesses. So it's that repetition every 2 generations or generation and a half.
That led to this circumstance. Yeah.
So,
Thank you for that.
yeah, I think it's important to have that context
I do too.
because,
Yeah, I didn't know how to ask about apartheid. You know,
Yeah.
very conscious of like not that I'm naive, but I'm a little bit, I
Yeah.
guess, like ignorant of
Well-
the details in the way that someone
Yes,
who lived
yeah.
through it and understands it.
so you know, if I look back on it, I grew up in a war zone.
Yeah,
I spent a number of times sitting in the jail while one of my friends was being beaten up because he or she was African or Indian, and what were they doing with a white kid?
there was
I've-
zero tolerance for any of that, and people would lose their lives besides just getting beaten.
Yes,
for that.
I think I was 5 when I watched my first murder. And I was probably around 6 or 7 listening to one of my good friends, closest friends, being killed in the cell while I was being held in the waiting room. You know, and then the other thing that they would do is instigate fights between the Africans and the Indians. So there'd be these huge African-Indian riots. And I remember being driven to school as probably a 6-year-old with rocks flying through. I was under a blanket in the back of on the floor in the back of the car as rocks flew through the windows. And I remember, as probably even maybe younger than that, we lived in the infectious disease hospital at the top of a bluff overlooking the Durban harbor.
Okay.
And I remember lying awake hearing screams of people dying as their houses were burned down. So
very vivid, terrible memories to have as a child.
Yeah. So let me go to the positive side. And why do I work with individual, family, and community resilience?
I'm telling you. It's okay to do that. It's a good thing when it happens. Yeah, I wanted to know anyways.
So with parents being held under banning orders, which meant you could only have two adults in a house at any one time.
Yeah.
They couldn't have gatherings.
Okay.
I remember when, as a little girl, when my father had already died, and it was just my mother, my little brother, and me, and the secret police would break down the door in the middle of the night, throw our books on the floor looking for contraband literature. And
sounds like Florida.
it's going to be. I know it's
politically incorrect, but yeah.
No, but it really, when I watched, the first time I really howled since I've been in this country, was watching children being rounded up and put into cells. And
that's horrible.
It was because it took me right back to what I grew up with.
I'm sorry.
So the counter was that because so many of our friends were having to slip out of the country to save their lives, or they were killed in prison or under banning orders, I was the oldest in our friendship circle. I was the oldest of 32 non-blood siblings. And at all times, there was always this sense of security, that one of the elders was always around. We were never really alone. And there was this incredible intensity of love, safety, and mission. We're all doing the right thing, and it's for a higher purpose.
Yeah.
And that sense of resilience in connection is what underpins all of my work.
I see. That's where it comes from.
Yeah, and it comes from the African belief of Ubuntu.
Yeah. I remember the story from our lunch yesterday.
Yes.
And I told it to my wife and our friend Cheyenne at dinner last night. I was and Pam was here too.
Yes.
And it was very touching, and I appreciated the story. And if I can, I'd like to repeat it. Just
please do.
And tell me if I get it wrong. But there's an elder, an adult, who has a bag of candy, and he gets the local children together to have a race, and he says the winner of the race gets the bag of candy, and the children race, and the one winner receives the bag of candy, and instead of immediately taking a piece for himself, he begins to hand it out to everyone, and the elder asks, this is, how come you're giving it out? You're the winner. It's for you. And he said, well, without the others, there would be no race.
Right.
So there would be no winner. So it's an acknowledgement, I guess, of the community.
Yes.
And we're all in it together.
I only exist in relationship and because you are here with me.
It's a beautiful thought. And it would be a lot. You would be out of work if we were all doing that.
That would be wonderful, because as far as I'm concerned, if we think about the community as a natural resource system,
yes, absolutely,
family and community, and the helpers and the professionals,
yes,
as an ancillary or artificial system that should only be called on when there are major issues.
yes.
I truly believe that the more work we're doing in prevention
Yes.
and helping people access their inherent resilience, because every living thing moves towards healing. You know, we had an absolutely amazing example. We're living in a ski resort.
Yeah.
So one of our sons shattered his shoulder skiing,
Sorry.
and the orthopedic surgeon said to him, "You have two choices." He's a young man.
Yeah.
I can replace your shoulder,
Uh-huh.
or you can sit absolutely still for 6 weeks in a recliner, and the bones will knit. He sat 6 weeks. It still looks, when you see an x-ray, you can see the little lines. It looks like crazy paving.
Okay.
But that whole shattered shoulder knitted
Repaired itself.
and repaired itself.
That's amazing, because I actually have a shoulder injury. My the labrum has a
Yes.
slight tear in it,
Yeah.
and the doctor said it would never heal. He said that, you know, I would like I could just deal with it until it really needs surgery. But that's actually not true, I guess.
Well, this
Depending
was
on the
bones.
injury.
This was
bones.
bones.
Not okay.
This is
That's
bones, not
different.
ligaments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So
But
that's
ligaments, I went through having my right knee reconstructed
Sure.
because I'd torn all the ligaments. My left knee, I decided to leave the ACL, anterior cruciate ligament,
yes.
and it's healed.
That's incredible. Yeah, our body naturally wants that. Yeah.
And so do our brains, so do our
Yes.
hearts and our souls. You know, I think, if you look at all of nature, there is that tendency towards healing.
Yeah.
And I think we forget that with humans. You know, we all feel that if a relationship's broken, it's broken forever. And a lot of it is our own sense of insecurity, not being enough. And I think if one can really start,
That's a really big word. I've had some really good discussions just on that word.
Yeah.
You know, what is that?
What is enough?
Yes. Yeah. What do we need that we don't have? It's
Right.
like we have what we need. You know, really do. You know, we live in a time
Well,
where
it just needs to be in other countries and other cultures, and even our own country, in the areas where enough is way less than in some areas.
Yeah. I want to ask before we move on about the non-blood siblings.
Yes.
Because I find that to be something that my family has. I have, non-blood family members.
Yes.
And I've tried to explain that to
Right.
people that I call some people uncle, but they're not really related. And people, don't always get it for
Right.
whatever reasons.
Yes.
But I find that very appropriate to just touch on is that like part of the community's resilience is that you look at the people that aren't related to you that you're interacting with regularly.
Our family of choice.
Yeah, family of choice. That's a perfect way to look at it. I feel like a lot of the problems we deal with, if we just saw the people around us as they could have been family just for whatever lucky chance that I have this body and you have that one. Anybody could have been.
We're all part of a human race.
Yeah.
And I think the more divisive we are, the more we're blinded to similarities. It's and when it's institutionalized, it gets extremely challenging.
Well,
I had a reverse experience when I moved to the States with my kids. My youngest daughter at that point was just on the between I think she was in 3rd grade.
Okay.
And she came home in tears and said, "Mom, they hate me because I'm white." And she was a white South African, and they assumed that she had been part of apartheid and oppression. And, it was just that shock of...
Yeah. Well, and also the nature of like assuming you understand things about people. And that's a big part of what the name of the podcast is we don't always see what's really going on with people.
Exactly.
And that's
where the storytelling is so important.
Yeah. Well,
yes.
Talk to me about the storytelling in your work, because I found that to be
Yes.
like a very intriguing part of our very meaningful lunch yesterday, and I'd like to hear how it applies, and how you learned that. Did that come from the culture in South Africa as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The what I realized as I was older and working was that as a child I had spent a lot of time in the African tribes,
Yeah.
and as kids we would be able to we sat with the African storyteller, because there's an oral tradition where instead of the history being written, it's told from generation to generation. So as a little kid, I would sit spellbound as the storyteller
Sure.
told
Yeah.
the stories.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I, as an adult psychiatrist, I was consulting to the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, on the selection of their next generation of spiritual advisors. And one of the groups was African Presbyterian ministers.
Okay.
And they were being trained as ministers. They were ministers, and they were being trained to work in the urban community
Okay.
with couples and so on.
Sure.
And to deal with the violence and all the problems of an urban community. And so I was very excited. I thought, now I'm going to have a lot of fun, because the Africans know their stories. So I'm going to do genograms, the family professional's way of depicting a family tree.
Okay.
Got out my flip charts and pens and had them all on the floor, drawing. And I was absolutely shocked. I walked around the room, and there were a couple of grandparents, but mostly it was just a mother or some siblings. There was no family there. And so I stopped and I said, "What's going on? Where are the rest of your families?" "We don't know." These were single mothers or fathers who had come. They would often leave the kids with local people to go back to the tribe to take money or whatever. But these young ministers didn't know anything.
Wow.
I sent them all back to their tribes of origin
Okay.
to learn about family and the stories.
It's vital to.
And they came back totally different.
So affected by the history of their community.
Right.
Yeah.
So then later on, when I was looking at where does our resilience come from, my hypothesis was that the more connected we are to our families and the better connected we are to our culture, the less we would take risks with our bodies, whether it's substances, driving too fast, all the kind of risks that kids take, and often adults and older adults. So my team and I did a series of studies.
Okay.
And the measures were frequency of contact with extended family, how often and who they were able to be in contact with, how many generations.
All right.
And then that was for connection to family. Connection to culture was how many stories they knew and how far back.
Wow.
And the more stories they knew, the less risk-taking.
Interesting.
Then we looked at what happens if there are horrible stories of murder, suicide, fires, war, versus if there are stories of happy families.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the resilient stories, those people took the least risk.
Okay.
The next risk was the vulnerable stories. And the highest risk was those who knew no stories at all.
I think that's the proof right there. Your hypothesis was supported.
So then we looked at the actual stories.
Yeah.
And, we had the themes of vulnerability versus resilience.
Okay.
Then we looked at those stories, and the content was identical.
Wow.
The vulnerable and resilient stories. And the only difference was the way that people viewed themselves and their families. we're a family that's overcome these horrible things and I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
Versus, look at this. It's a family that is doomed. We've had all of these things and there's no hope. So being able to look at not just the negative, but every negative has a positive pole.
Sure. It's where you focus your
it's
look,
where you focus. So if you can shift that focus to a resilient focus and look at the history through time, it changes the way people view themselves and their futures.
That's absolutely fascinating to me.
Taking that transitional pathway from the past, and it's the past of the family, the past of the country they live in or the city.
Sure.
And looking at that despair from the past and switching it by seeing where it is in the present and what are the themes and values that keep us alive and that we want to see in the generations to come. And reconnecting that transitional pathway brings hope and accesses resilience.
I'm going to be practicing learning more stories. And I want to ask about the generational trauma of your work and the understanding of how we pass things on. I also had a conversation with my wife's friend last night who's studying psychology and ultimately neuropsychology. And she was sharing how there was a study on rats and how the male rat was scared by something and then impregnated a thing, and then the male rat never saw the kids of the female, and then those kids when
had the same fear,
reacted the same to the certain stimulus, and the control group it didn't happen. Talk to me about that and how our bodies and minds work, because that's fascinating too.
So there's several. I mean, there are a lot of different studies. And
we're not rats.
No, we're not rats. But the basics are that we are changed by our environment. Our genes don't change, but the way in which they're expressed changes. So, for example, if a survival instinct is, when that happens, to survive, I've got to react with fear. That's something that gets transmitted through genetically.
DNA.
It's not in the DNA. No? It's the expression of the gene. So if we take it into humans and look, for example, at both mental health and substance use disorder, or any of the chronic relapsing diseases like asthma, diabetes, hypertension, etc. Schizophrenia. Right? There was a study in Finland where they had more than usual, much higher rate than usual of schizophrenia. So this study looked at identical twins who had been separated at birth. And compared when one twin had gone into a family with schizophrenia versus the twin who went into a family without schizophrenia. Because everybody prior to that study believed that schizophrenia was strongly genetic and invariable, inevitable.
I see.
It was a 40-year follow-up trial. And when they'd finished the study, NIMH made them go back because by then the gene had been understood. And so they had to go back and do the genetic studies to show. And what happened was the kid from a family with schizophrenia adopted into a family without schizophrenia did not develop schizophrenia.
Interesting.
The kid from a family without schizophrenia adopted into a family with schizophrenia did. Similarly with substance use disorder. A kid who grows up with a lot of trauma, whether it's personal or intergenerational, who then also has the gene for whether it's alcohol or marijuana or whatever it is likely to develop the disease.
Because of that trauma.
But it's only both and.
Okay.
Half the people who develop substance use disorder of any kind or behavioral compulsions
Okay.
do not have the gene, but may have the trauma.
Wow.
So you can have,
So
so it's a much lower rate if you have the gene or have the trauma than if you have both.
it's amazing what we can understand with time and focus, and especially our minds are capable of so much.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what it basically means is that there's no reason that everybody shouldn't get healthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because regardless of what we've been through, if we access our resilience and change our behavior patterns, we can be healthy and happy.
There's nothing more hopeful and positive than what you just said, and that's kind of my goal, is to remind people of that through my own, pain and story, is just to keep sharing that message.
Yeah.
I love
I've worked in war zones and mass disasters, and people are able to recover and not transmit the trauma to future generations.
It's a real amazing feat and blessing, and the work you've done that I'm learning about more and more, which I didn't know about because of probably your success in accomplishing the tread lightly.
Tread lightly and leave no footprints.
Yeah.
Well, that's really only with the link work. The other protocols I own, claimed. We have training programs that are public.
Which I'm very interested in as well. And those
love to have you trained.
The Arise.
Arise is one of them. Life is another. Link individual family empowerment, where we work with groups of people who are struggling with the same issues. So, for example, the NIMH trial that was done was with women who were abused in their domestic violence.
Yep.
And those women were taught how to manage their safety, and learned about sexually transmitted diseases, et cetera, And they went backwards and forwards from doing family stories, coming back, working with the family on resilience, coming back to the group.
Yeah.
And their rate they were able to tell their partners that they changed behavior or left, and they were safe, and reduced rate of sexually transmitted disease. So
that's fantastic.
And we used that same model with women in a number of different cities and countries.
Okay.
And we also used the same model with early in the HIV pandemic, with women who were infected with HIV.
You helped with that as well.
Yeah. I wrote the first book on the interface of the physical and emotional and family. It was called AIDS, Health and Mental Health.
I need to read your work. I admit that I just began learning about you through Megan, in the last couple months, and it's amazing to me how much of an impact you've had on the world. And yet, your name has not come up in my, at least that I know of. And it's fascinating to get to learn about you now. I'm curious about with the depth and weight of the work that you've done. For you, what mental health challenges have you faced in your time that really speak to that resilience, having to dig deep and, have the the time or space to get through things?
Right. It's a very good question. And it's one that I don't think much about, so it's good that you've asked. I think it started for me when I was 3, and several things happened between the ages of 3 and 5. The first was that I was playing with some African kids on a dung floor.
Dung?
Dung.
Okay.
Pounded down like clay.
Okay, yeah.
And developed diphtheria. And I was the only one of a bunch of it was a major diphtheria epidemic. And I know one of our close friends, happened to be white, lost an infant, and I was one of the few survivors of that whole epidemic because I'd been inoculated.
Okay.
But because I was so very sick, I had a lot of complications, including being paralyzed. And because they thought I was dying, in those days they thought that irradiating the thymus gland would save my life.
Okay.
They, so state of the art, the state of medicine then
At that point.
was the thymus gland is responsible for infection.
Okay.
We now know it's responsible for immunity. So it totally killed my immune system.
Oh.
So what I remember, in terms of it was probably my first great mental health challenge, was being isolated in a radiation chamber. And then it took, I think it felt like forever, but it must have been about 3 or 4 days of complete isolation. First of all, the machines.
Because of the radiation?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, waiting for the radiation to dissipate.
What is that machine like?
And
do you mind explaining just so I have a visual understanding? Is it like you're in like a tube and you lay in there and they... Or?
I don't. All I remember
Okay.
is the glass chamber.
Yeah.
And not being able to talk to my parents, be held.
Yeah. At a young age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, being paralyzed for 2 years. So instead of playing with friends, I would be carried out to a couch on the porch and watch everybody else playing. So learning to be objective and survive without being part of the group. So that sense of, which you hear from a lot of people in recovery from addiction, is, which I am. I'm 61 years in recovery.
Congratulations.
Thank you. That sense of being on the outside looking in.
Okay.
So, I earned that.
Yes, you did.
The resilient part of the story was that my father taught me to read and write so I wouldn't be bored. So, and as soon as I was no longer infectious, I was taken to the university and, and did some amazing work there. So it was a very precious time.
Wow, yeah.
But it was, there were lots of consequences. There was no physical therapy, so I was sent to a ballet class. There were all these delicate little fairies prancing around, and I was this clumsy fat kid who couldn't
to walk
move.
Again. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I understand.
So,
I went through that too with my health issues.
Yeah.
That's what led to my biggest mental health challenges as well. Please continue.
Yeah. And then because I was, reading and writing and reading things that were way beyond kids my age, we moved a lot. So I would be in first grade and they'd move me to second and then to third. So I went through first, second, third grade in, I think, 6 different places.
Wow. Yeah. It's like
So
as a child,
the connections weren't there,
Yeah.
But I still had the connection to family. And then I was 6 when my dad died, and we moved completely and went from living very comfortably to penury. So my brother was a month old, I was 6, and my mother had to suddenly go get a job.
Wow.
So we lived in the red light district and near the docks. And my mother never knew I would come home after school and be raising the kid because she could only afford care for the mornings. And she never knew that I relied on the ladies of the night in our building to help me with the baby. They were amazing. So again, it was knowing that I could ask for help from the people who were there.
Yeah, that was
without, and knowing not to judge.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had judged those people that you'd how would you have made ends meet
I wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point about humanity too, is, some people do what they have to do to survive, but it doesn't mean deep down they're not loving, caring people and don't want to help others.
Right.
Sometimes people are just in a very bad circumstance.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to remember. And another reason not to judge, when you don't really know what someone's going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then because of the radiation and not having an immune system, I've now had multiple cancers and had to deal with all of those.
Oh, yeah.
So
So I mean, one of the treatments for cancer is radiation. That's not an option.
No, I've had more radiation.
You've had to have even more.
Oh yes.
Yeah, that's a lot, Judith. Yeah.
So the other counter for me was when I was probably between 3 and 5. I sat with an Isangoma, a traditional African healer, as she threw the bones. And I'll send you the story I wrote.
Okay, yeah.
And there were 2 women. One was accusing the other one of killing her child, her young son, or a young adult son.
Yeah.
And the Isangoma, the traditional African healer, threw the bones and is reading the bones, and she's throwing herbs in the fire, and the flames are rising. Yeah. And as kids, we're behind her, and the whole circle of women who are the judiciary are going when they hear something they agree with, and when they don't. And you hear so it's the flames, the bones, and the intonation of the women.
Yes.
Because only if things can't be resolved at the Isangoma level do they go to the tribal council.
Okay.
Okay. And so she has to determine whether this is something that goes to the tribal council. Uh-huh. And as the flames are getting higher and higher, I saw the whole story unfolding in the flames. And I burst out and said what I was saying. And she said, "Tula wena," and pushed me behind her.
And I was like, "Get back.
Keep quiet.
Keep quiet."
And afterwards she said, "You are a Sangoma."
Oh.
So I've known since I was very little
Wow.
that that's who I am.
Wow.
So for me, that was, regardless of whatever I did, that was going to be central.
I certainly think you've lived up to that title from that young age. One of the reasons why I was very comfortable doing a podcast about mental health is because I think that the music I've been able to perform for years to relate to what you're saying is, it's all about healing. It's all about
absolutely.
making
That's how I
better.
survived.
Yeah.
Was with my piano. I was about 3 or 4, and my uncle had my grandmother's piano. And when he heard me play it, he gave it to me. And that piano stayed with me until my mother had to move and gave it away. And then I got a piano that was the most incredible soul piano. Friend of mine his family had moved from Austria, and he collected a particular kind of furniture, and the piano was a traditional old upright with beautifully carved wood and brass candlesticks. And he said, "Look, piano's sitting in the garage, but if you want a piano, just borrow it." And it didn't sound as though it needed tuning. It had been in the garage for 14 years or something. Anyway, I called the head of the music school at University of Cape Town, Mr. Frerich, and he said he'd come and tune it for me. And he opened the thing up, and this little guy with a shock of white hair and smaller than I was at that point.
Okay.
And he was sitting on the floor hugging the piano and tears streaming down his face.
What?
And I said, "Mr. Frerich, what is this about?" And he pointed, and he'd signed the piano. He made it for the last Archduke of Austria.
Oh my God.
He was the piano builder.
That's incredible.
It had a mute. It sounded like a harpsichord if I used the mute.
Wow.
That
is such an incredible instrument to build too. It is a very difficult thing to build well.
Yeah. Well,
and which is why
they would borrow it for concerts at the university because
wonderful.
It had a soul.
Yeah.
It always reminded me of, I don't know if you ever read as a kid, The Immortal Piano.
No, I haven't read that one.
It was a piano that survived the battlefield of Siena.
Okay.
It was the only thing standing at the end of the battlefield with no bullet holes, nothing.
That's a wild thing.
And it's a magnificent piano, and there was a beautiful story written about it. I have a recording of the Bach partitas played on it.
Okay.
But so this was my immortal piano.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's so special. There's something I've known about instruments, or feel about instruments, I should say, is that like when you play a new instrument, it has songs that it gives you. That there's a
Absolutely. I had
new,
that with my guitar particularly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I love that, and I could keep talking to you about so many things for so long, and we will continue our talks
will.
and all that. But the last thing I always have been trying to ask in the podcast relates to music and mental health and resilience. It's, is there a song, and this is for a playlist that I've been,
Yes.
and I'm giving you a few seconds to start thinking about it. Is there a song that has inspired you and helped you through a difficult time?
There are a lot of songs that inspire me. I mean, I have a cupboard full of CDs and music that I love.
Wonderful.
But when I need inspiration, it's Bach, Beethoven sometimes, and then a bunch of the Spanish, Giuliani, and then the Spanish Albanese, and
Is there?
I played classical guitar for years. So
I didn't know that. How wonderful. Well,
so I used to alternate instruments when I didn't have enough time to practice one. I'd switch to the.
Oh yeah, that's.
And I had a number of friends. We had a little group with a cellist and.
How nice.
Yeah.
I wonder, do you have any recordings from back then?
Yeah.
No. Okay. Well, I'll dream about it.
Yeah.
I wonder, is there a piece by Bach that you would say you would go to, or?
Generally, if I love the partitas because they're so complete.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Bach violin. It's
a very moving.
The violin concerto is perfection, and then of course the Beethoven double violin concerto. And I played Beethoven for years, but really, I like a lot of the other composers.
Sure.
But the classic Spanish, and then Bach and Beethoven.
Okay, I love that.
What I always end up with, and probably if I'm sort of a little bit unhappy, I'll play Mozart.
Yeah.
Like
a lot more
just
grit.
Much more fun. And lighter and
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
but they're very much part of my partner with the International Recovery Institute and I teach a course on working with musicians.
Oh, I didn't know.
And
more great.
And I have several pieces that I use in between to have them, to have the trainees who are going to be recovery specialists or interventionists working with musicians, have them close their eyes and just tell me what mood it puts them in. And we have this whole selection of pieces that we play that's as part of having them understand how important music is to the soul.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of studies happening now that show that music helps heal.
It helps, not only helps the soul heal, it helps the brain heal.
Yes. That's what I'm getting at.
And the body.
Yeah, they're all working together, hopefully.
Hopefully, biopsychosocial.
Yeah, totally. And well, the thing I really appreciate about that answer is that whenever I think of anything classical music, I think of my grandmother, Louise Chesler, who the name of this podcast, What Could Be Bad, is the last thing she ever said to me. When she was in hospice, she had a moment of clarity when I went to visit her. At least that's what I believe it was. And I asked her how she was feeling. And she looked at me and smiled while holding my hand and said, "What could be bad?" And it was a moment of positivity and submission and contentment. And, that's what I'm trying to share.
Absolutely.
So thank you for reminding me of her. Most of all, that was very special to hear. And I'll be listening. I'm going to add the partitas to the playlist, and I'll share a link with you and with everyone. But Judith, I can't thank you enough for just being open with me and doing what you're doing. And I can't wait for all the things ahead that we'll be able to do together, and just getting to know you more is going to be an absolute pleasure in my life. So thank you.
Thank you for being here and being part of this whole community resilience effort with us.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing the change happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for being here. Be good to yourselves. Be good to others. And we'll see you next week.